fairly well situated. If there's anybody out there who can hear me, who can't see me, we're about to get started here. So everyone, I would like to ask you to please give us a big warm welcome here to Troy Marden.
Well, I'm glad you all are not in your gardens. I was on my way over here this morning on the phone with somebody. They said, "What do you mean you're on your way to Union City? Why aren't you gardening today?" It's like, well, gotta make a living. So, gardening's an expensive hobby. Gotta get out here and work. So, here we are. I think spring may have finally sprung. You know, we're going to have dogwood and redbud winter all at the same time because they're both blooming now, all at once. And then we've got blackberry winter still to go, and locust winter still to go. So we'll hope that those winters are kind to us, and that maybe we'll only get down into the 40s a few times and not have some freak frost like end of April last year. I don't know about you all, but I'm ready to garden after this winter, and the weeds are already ahead of me. I got a little gardening done just a couple of hours late yesterday afternoon because I knew I was going to be out all day today, and I'm going to be up. I'm going home tonight because I'm going to be up when the sun comes up tomorrow, and I'm not coming in until the sun goes down. I don't care who comes by, who calls, who rings the doorbell. They'll just have to come around back and find me where I am, and if they don't find me, too bad. Because if I don't get ahead of it now, I will never be ahead of it for the rest of the season. And then I'll be unhappy, and everybody else around me will be unhappy, and that's not a good situation to be in. So, but the folks here at Soleil, I'm so happy to be back. I was here last fall for a little song and dance, and Jason Reeves was here last fall. We did a little Q&A thing in the evening with the Master Gardeners. I spoke during the afternoon, and he did a little Q&A thing with me in the evening. And anybody going on Jason and Andy's trip to England? Besides my two stalkers, is anybody going on Jason and Andy's trip to England? Obviously, they didn't serve the restraining order before we got here today. Well, I'm going.
I know.
Do you know that? I'm going. So, actually, our garden tour company is managing that trip this fall. So we'll talk about traveling a little bit later on, but mainly what we came in to talk about today was gardening in containers. And I think what I'm going to do is I brought up this huge selection of plants and a few pots, and rather than potting up a great big pot that then they have to turn around and try to sell for a whole bunch of money, and then they also have to try to pick it up and move it when I'm done potting it, I think we'll just talk about different ideas that you can use in your containers and what all is involved, and what kind of containers do you use, and what do I like and what you like, and all that sort of stuff. Now, here's a great thing that's happened in the last few years. All these up here, that's terracotta, that's glazed stuff. This is plastic, and it's not bad looking plastic. There's some pretty good fiberglass ones out there too that you can pick them up with one hand. So here's my first rule of thumb when it comes to container gardening. And rules may be broken, but I say my first rule of thumb, and if you visit my garden, you'll see that I do have a few smaller pots. But the main rule of thumb when gardening in containers is bigger is always better. The more volume of soil you have, the better your plants will grow. More importantly, in July and August, the less you have to water because you've got soil volume. That little clay pot down there in the front that's only about 12 inches in diameter, by August, you're going to be out there watering that sucker 3 times a day. Morning, noon, and night, it's going to have to be watered unless it's got a cactus in it, which would be all right too. Cactus or agave would be pretty in that pot. There is, for my big garden containers, my main garden containers, the ones that sit on either side of the front door and a few that line the path out back, nothing smaller ever than 16 inches. And 18, 22, 24, 27 is better. Whatever scale you can accommodate and not have it look silly, buy the biggest one that you can accommodate. because your plants, you can put more things in them for one, and you will have a much greater volume of soil. It will hold water longer, it will hold fertilizer longer, your plants will grow better, the soil won't heat up as quickly, and that's a big problem in the summertime here in the South, is that the sun comes in and starts beating on the sides of these pots, and even the ones that are glazed, that soil will get hot. And when the roots of a plant get hot, it puts them in distress. Even if they're watered well, they will become distressed and they'll flag and wilt. So the greater volume of soil you have, the cooler it will stay. You're also obviously in containers watering more frequently, even in large pots. The only water and fertilizer that these plants growing in containers have is the water and fertilizer that you give them. And particularly fertilizer. You're watering a lot more often, generally speaking, than you feed, unless you're one of those that feeds a very weak dilution of fertilizer every time you water. But for most of us, me included, I remember to fertilize every couple of weeks or maybe once a month if the plants are lucky in the summertime. But I'm watering every day, or in my big containers maybe every second day or third day, and you're washing that fertilizer out of the soil. So you plant your pots in late April, early May, and by the end of June, things are starting to look sometimes a little peaked, and certainly by the end of July, and you kind of wonder why. I've watered religiously, I haven't forgotten to water, nothing's dried out. They don't have any food left. There's nothing for them to eat. You've washed it all out of the soil. So you need to remember that you have to fertilize regularly, because the only fertilizer they have is what's in that container. And if it's a container that big, that might get you through 3 or 4 months of the summer if you're feeding regularly, or if you mix Osmocote into your soil when you plant, or if you mix Flower Tone or Plant Tone or one of those Scotoma organic slow release type fertilizers in your potting soil when you plant. You may get by for a couple of months, but eventually you're going to wash all those nutrients out of the soil, and the only way to get more in is for you to put them there. So you either put more Osmocote in, you top dress with a granular fertilizer of some kind, or you're mixing up a liquid and pouring it on the roots when you water. I'm going to try to do better this year with my container plants because I always feel sorry for them, and I'm really going to try to feed everything about half strength, but every week, and just really keep those plants going. I finally am to a point, he says, where I have almost all of the plants in the ground that need to be in the ground. I don't have a huge stash of things sitting over to the side waiting to be planted. And so I want to focus, for me personally, more on my containers and my maintenance and just keeping up with things better, because it seems like I'm always behind, and then when you throw my travel schedule into it, it doesn't help matters any. Before we really get into sort of container combinations and things, let's also talk about one more thing, and that is potting soil. What kind of soil do you use in your containers? Do you use soil that you've dug out of the yard, soil that you've dug out of the garden? Absolutely not. And why? Because the more you water, our soil in Tennessee, even if you live in areas where we have sandy pockets and those kind of things, we are clay-based primarily, almost all the way across the state. And the more you water, the more that soil settles, and the more it compacts, and the more those tiny little clay particles stick together. And what you'll find is if you actually use garden soil and you fill your pot clear full at the top, by the end of the summer, you'll have about 6 inches of space from the top of the pot to the top of your soil. It's because that soil has compacted down like concrete, and your roots, the plant's roots, can't grow through that. And so, no garden soil. If you are using a little bit of garden soil, you need to mix it at least 50-50 with soil conditioner, compost, pine fines, maybe even some sand. I'm reticent to even use the word sand when it comes to soil, because so many people make the mistake of using sand in their gardens, because we have this idea that I need better drainage, so if I put sand in my clay soil, it will make my soil drain better. But if you will remember that you have in a bag of Quickcrete, there is clay and sand, and you take it home and you add water to it, and it sets up like a Bricko block, which is exactly what your garden soil will do if you put sand in it with no organic matter. So you have to have, if you're going to use real garden soil of any kind, or even compost, you want to have maybe a third soil, a third organic matter, and a third drainage material, like pine fines or sand or a blend of the two. If you don't, you will end up with concrete by the end of the season, and your plants will be, if not dead, horrible looking. I buy ready-made, soil-less bags of potting soil, the peat-based potting soils. I don't know what they carry here at Soleil, but there are any number of them that are good. Some of them have a little bit of fertilizer already mixed into the bag. I'm sure they have. And they make some of their own here, so that's a good thing too. So, you know, anything that gives you a good basis to start with, and it really is important in containers to have good drainage. You know, my grandmother used to, every clay pot that broke, she saved the shards and put down in the bottom of the pot and all that sort of stuff. I suppose that's all well and good, except there's one problem with that, and that is if you're using a regular clay pot, or if you're using a pot like that that maybe has a saucer that sits under it, in order to wick that water up out of the saucer, the soil in the bottom of the pot has to be in contact with the water in the saucer. And if you have 2 inches of gravel or 2 inches of pot shards in the bottom of your clay pot, that wicking action can't happen. I think the philosophy was that it kept the roots from clogging up the holes in the bottom of the pot, but that's not really a viable thing so much. But anyway, good potting soil, good soil that is meant to be in containers, a good fertilizing routine, and regular watering. And when I say regular watering, everybody says, well, how often should I water? Should I water every day? Should I water every other day? Should I water twice a day? How much should I water? You should water how much the pot requires. And every pot, every size pot, is going to be different. And depending on how you have that pot planted, it's going to be different. If it's succulents and they want to be a little drier, obviously you're going to water less. If it's this water-thirsty hibiscus that every afternoon at 3 o'clock wilts regardless of whether it's wet or not, like a hydrangea, you know, you're going to have to water more. If you have this and 15 annuals planted around the base of it, and that pot gets completely full of roots by the end of July, early in the season you're going to water less, and the more root bound that pot becomes toward the end of the season, the more you're going to water. You may find that when you very first plant them, you water these big pots once or twice a week. By the end of August, you might like to be watering these big pots twice a day because they're root bound. They are full of roots. Yes?
Are you saying using soil or potting soil from top to bottom?
Potting soil from top to bottom.
Okay.
I use nothing in the bottoms of my pots, and they sit in saucers. Almost all of my pots, I use clay almost exclusively in my garden, just personal preference. It's not because I don't like the glazed pots, it's just clays. I tend to buy inexpensive clay pots, and if they last 5 years, I throw them away and go buy new ones. So that's kind of what I do. But and also, I'm gone a lot, and people are taking care of the garden. If they break a pot, they've broken a $14 pot and not a $114 pot or a $400 pot. And I've had that happen. So, you know, live and learn.
Do you store them in the winter?
I leave them out, and if they flake off after 3 years, I just throw them away and buy new ones. I just do. I know that probably sounds wasteful, but, you know, at some point, something's got to give. So let's, soil, water, fertilizer, all those important things. What about storing these containers and things in the wintertime? What can you leave out and what can you not? Obviously the plastic you can leave out. The fiberglass you can leave out. Concrete you can leave out. If it's good quality concrete, you can leave it out year round. Terracotta, after 3 or 4 seasons, most terracotta, unless it's really good terracotta. Now I have been to Italy to some terracotta foundries where they're actually making really good terracotta. like the kind that the Siebert and Rice Pottery Company from New Jersey sells here in the States. And I had been through some pottery graveyards that would just make you green with envy, where pots have been sitting out in the elements for 150 years and there's not a crack in them. They're that good. Those also cost about $3,000 a piece. So I choose to spend my garden budget elsewhere and I buy $15 pots. But I do love these big glazed pots. Most of the time I recommend that you, unless they're on a covered porch where they're not going to get wet, they can stay outdoors as long as they're not going to get wet. But what happens is, after a few seasons, this glaze will begin to crack. And when it begins to crack, it will begin to get moisture in it. And once it gets moisture in it, we all know that when water freezes, it expands and it will begin to flake the color, the glaze, off of the outsides of these pots. Eventually, it will probably crack the pot completely. So just understand that going into it, and you know, these beasts are heavy. I made the young boys move this. I carried some of these, but I made the young guys move this morning. So I still want to be able to garden tomorrow. If I could do that by myself, I probably wouldn't have. So that's, you know, terracotta, depending on the terracotta. Glaze, if it's covered in the winter time, is fine outdoors, as long as it's on a covered porch. It doesn't even have to be a screened-in enclosed porch, as long as it doesn't get wet too much. It'll be fine. But anything that's going to get wet that is porous should go in for the winter. And that means into a garage, into a garden shed. It can freeze as long as it's dry. That's the key. So there we are. So then, how do we go about planting these containers, and when do you plant, and what do you plant, and all that? So I'm a seasonal gardener, and I like my pots to look good all year round, and I try to keep them, something in them, all through the winter months. And living, even in the upper part of the South, most of the time, unless we have a winter like we've had this last couple of winters, but you can grow, you know, come in to the garden center in October, November, get some really beautiful conifers to stick in these pots during the winter time. Only has to be one thing. If you want to mix it up a little bit, get some really beautiful conifers and get some coral bells, heuchera. Get some violas. Pansies in a pot, most of the time by the middle of the winter they've frozen out, but violas will live almost always through the winter, unless we have a winter like we've had the last one or two. But I hope we get in a little more normal pattern. Any number of other evergreen things that you can put in these containers in the winter, and in the spring, when it's time to change them out, find a spot in the garden for them. They'll live through the winter, then you've got some ready-made perennials or some evergreens to put out in the garden later on. I have a couple of clients where we have evergreens that have a little home in the garden that they go to in the spring when we take them out of their pots, and in the fall we dig them up and we stick them back into containers for the winter, and we've done that for several years in a row. So you can do those kinds of things too. If you don't want to keep buying and adding to your conifer collection, you can do that and dig. But for me, I do primarily annuals in my containers because I like them big and fat and full, especially during the main part of the growing season. But I do generally put things in the wintertime. Sometimes I grabbed a few things. I know there's a sale rack out front. There's some really pretty primroses out there still. Look at these. Who wouldn't want that in a container right now? And here's the thing. You could have planted these a month ago or 6 weeks ago, the beginning of March. They're frost tolerant. Now, when we got down into the teens, you probably would have had to scoot them inside or at least throw a couple of towels over them to keep the little blooms from freezing off of them. But get in here early and start, even if you don't take your evergreens out of your pots, take the coral bells out, throw them in the ground, get them ready, get some spring color going. You know, by the 1st of March, middle of March, I am jonesing for some spring color, and there's nothing happier than a primrose. So get out and get those. Even now, if you need a little extra color and some of the pansies are failing, you get another good 8 weeks out of pansies. If they're half price, buy them. What else do you spend $1 on and get 8 weeks of, you know, joy out of, $2 on, whatever. Get out there and get some of that stuff. And then we're looking, of course, toward later spring, season warming up, summertime, and what do? So I went and raided John's greenhouses a little while ago. Let me just tell you a secret about going through somebody's greenhouses. The really good stuff is always in the back. They put all the really bright, colorful stuff, like the impatiens and the petunias, out front because all of us are plant collectors and we like to hoard stuff, and John is especially that. So go to the back greenhouse. Go to the back of the greenhouse. He's going to kill me if he hears something. Always the good stuff is in the back of the greenhouses. Always. Squirreled away in some corner, hoping that you'll be distracted by the impatiens and the petunias up front, because you know, if the cool stuff doesn't sell, then he gets to play with it later on in the summertime, right? So these were in the far back corner of one of the greenhouses. This is one of the greatest plants. If you haven't grown this is Dianella. And this is about as big as it gets. But these little stalks of blooms that don't look like much right now are going to turn into cobalt blue berries. And this will just keep getting fuller and fuller and fuller all summer long. And this makes a really great filler plant. So, you know, it's things like that that you have to be on the lookout for.
What did you call that?
Dianella, D-I-A-N-E-L-L-A. It looks very similar to the plant that we call New Zealand flax, or phormium. But phormium doesn't do very well here. Dianella loves it here. New Zealand flax is kind of a mountainous plant. It likes it cooler. But the Dianella is a tropical plant. It likes the heat and humidity. So you can see, speaking of tropicals, let's just dive into this. Speaking of tropicals, I have a lot of tropical plants sitting up here. Why? Because they like it hot and they like it humid. And the hotter and more humid it gets in the summertime, the faster and better they grow and the bigger and more beautiful they get. When the other plants that were so happy in the spring begin to sort of shrink, these are standing up proud and tall and taking center stage. Even over here in some of these filler plants, and we'll get around to a lot of this, I'm always looking for things that are going to have great foliage all summer long. If you've heard me speak about garden design, it is foliage first. In a container, that is even more important because unless it's something like this hibiscus that is going to just keep pumping flowers out all summer long, regardless of what you do to it, you have to have great foliage combinations. Things like sweet potato vine. Yes, it's rampant. Get your shears out and just whack the thing in half every 2 or 3 weeks. It's a little bit of maintenance, but find things that thrive and give you great color with great foliage all summer long, and let the blooms sort of be the supporting characters, if you will. So tropicals. Okay, so when we're thinking about doing these containers, there was a thing that was going around a few years ago in the garden center business, some marketing scheme that people were trying to sell plants, and they said, okay, when you do your containers, you need a thriller, a filler, and a spiller. And kind of, you know, by the middle of May, the end of the day, we're all getting sort of punchy in the garden center business, and so we came up with this thing that you need a sticky uppy, a roundy moundy, and a hangy downy. And it's 5 o'clock, and please go home. But, so, those thrillers. Sometimes all you need is one plant in a pot. It doesn't always have to be a mixed container. I used to be a mixed container guy. Every container I did was a mixed container. I kind of got out of that phase. Now I have collections of containers, and I have one plant in each container and do collections of plants that way. And I still do some mixed pots too. Some of my great big pots I do mixed plantings in, because if you just stick one thing, unless it's a really impressive one thing, you know, something that big, you need something to sort of soften it. But there are plants like this red leaf banana. This is Insettia morellii, a banana relative. It's actually a banana cousin, but that by the end of the season they'll be 6 feet tall, and these leaves can get 5 feet long and 1.5 feet wide. So it's probably not something, if your front entryway is sort of narrow, you probably don't want something that's going to be 10 feet wide by the end of the summer on either side of the door. You may be going in through the garage. But if you use your containers out away from the house or out sitting in the garden, there's no reason that you can't use some things like this to get that big impact. And the other thing that happens in big containers like this is that you get this thing up high. You get up above the rest of the garden plants, and it becomes more of a focal point that way. So, yeah, full sun. Absolutely. Full sun. And I mean, one of the most impressive things you will ever grow in your garden. They're absolutely stunning, and they'll grow fast. They're heavy feeders. They want food, food, food. Then we have things like these tree-form hibiscus. These make great container plants, and the more you feed them and the more you care for them in the summertime, the hotter it gets, the more they'll bloom. And these will be this big by the end of the summer, and they may have 30 or 40 blooms open on them every day. They're so impressive. And again, you know, get something like that up in one of these pots. Get it up high. Stick it in this orange pot. You want some yellow pack, put it in there. You know, bright orange with that big goldy orange bloom, and then come in here and get wild and crazy with your color combinations. Do things like that. Put this together. Put that underneath here and let that fill out and be, you know, repeat that orange color, that pot with these impatiens. Or actually, you know, there's one color that'll make everything work. Oh, now, and that's that kind of pale blue color. That'll blend almost anything else you put with it together. So you do combinations like that in the bottom. Stick this thing up here in the top. Let it stand way up here like this and be that focal point. And just pack the bottom of that pot full of stuff. My other philosophy when I'm doing containers is go big or go home when it comes to buying plants. It's my philosophy when I'm buying containers. It's my philosophy when I'm buying plants. You're not buying that many plants to stick in a container. Don't start with plants that are this big. Go ahead and buy the 4-inch or 6-inch. If you're buying, let's just say, for instance, that you were just going to buy one plant to put in that pot and you want, don't start with one of these in a 4-inch pot. Start with this. Put this in there and be done with it. Pot it and go on, move on. Go to the next thing. That's a begonia. That's a begonia. Believe it or not. Shade. Shade plant. Morning sun. Morning sun. Use these really cool architectural plants. The other thing I like in low containers, like this. Sorry, this thing's heavy. But the other thing I like in low containers are low plants that sort of echo the shape of the pot. That also works. A low container, a sago palm like that, or an agave that has that sort of spreading habit, they also work in those low containers. In a taller container, I like something tall up on a stick, like this hibiscus, with stuff spilling out around the bottom of it. If that pot was even shorter and fatter and open at the top, bowl-like, low mounds of succulents, those kinds of things, dish garden sort of approach. Very architectural. Let's just talk about some of these fun plants. Lots of work going on in the group of plants known as the shrimp plants. This used to be an old-fashioned house plant. It didn't look like this. It had little yellow blossoms with white flowers sticking out of it. But there are all kinds of new color forms these days. And the nice thing is, they have taken these plants, which used to be short day plants that only bloomed in the wintertime, and they have bred that out of them. So now they'll flower all summer long. And You know, it used to be we never get to see these because who grows this in the wintertime? Nobody. It's tropical. It would bloom indoors if you had a heated sun porch or a little greenhouse or something during the short days of the winter. But it would never bloom in the summer. It would just be a green plot. So now we have all these great Justizias and different things that we, again, sometimes call shrimp plants because these little blooms that sort of, I guess, look like the tail of a shrimp. But all summer flowering now. And they'll, you know, if this group of flowers kind of finishes, they'll put on another big flush of growth, and then they'll have another big round of bloom, and it'll last for several weeks. And they'll just keep reflushing and reblooming all summer long, and get bigger and bigger. Great thing. This Cortellini, cordyline, comes in many, many, many forms and colors. These beautiful reds and burgundies and pinks. There are some kind of green and cream and pink striped forms. There are little bitty dwarf forms that only get 6 inches tall. There are forms like this that when they're full grown will be 3 feet. And again, a great sort of that thriller plant, that focal point that you're looking for in a container. One other thing that I'll mention about designing containers is depending on where they're sitting will determine where you put your tall focal point. If it's sitting out in the open where you get all the way around it, you may decide to center your focal point. If it's sitting up against a garage wall or a house wall, you may want your focal point back here at the back of the pot, your height all in the back, and then a medium something in front of that, and low spillers coming over the front of the container. So there's no right or wrong. There's no, you know, hard and fast rule. Like with any gardening, there are no hard and fast rules. It's all sort of about A, personal preference, and B, what fits the space that you're working with. So let's talk a little bit about plants, and then I'll answer some questions. So what am I looking for when I go out to the nursery and I go out and shop just like everybody else goes out and shops? I generally don't do it on Saturdays. It's too busy, and I've dealt with too many people all week long. And I go on Monday afternoon at 5:30, 30 minutes before they close, and sort of scamper around the garden center, which is a terrible time to go because Saturday and Sunday it's been totally picked over and there's nothing left by Monday afternoon. But you know, it is when I generally end up being in the garden center. But what am I looking for? Again, in containers, I'm looking for season-long interest. I do change my containers out 2 or 3 times a year. But once I plant for summer, I don't want to change them again until I'm thinking about fall and winter. So I'm looking for things that either flower all summer long or have great looking foliage all summer long, or in the best of both worlds, they have both. They have nice leaves and they have pretty flowers all summer long. That is a rarer combination, so most of the time you're going to have combinations of some things that look great in bloom and some things that look great in leaf. And that's where these foliage plants and things that I have up here become really important. So I think everybody's probably familiar with the sweet potato vines. This has come a long way in the last few years. You know, you used to plant a pot this size, and by the end of the summer, it'd run 10 feet and rooted itself down all the way across the garden. And then when you pull it up in the fall, you were pulling sweet potatoes up with it all the way along. These are real sweet potatoes. They do make sweet potatoes underground, and they'll really make sweet potatoes when they're in a pot because they're root bound, and it stresses them out, so they try to propagate, and the only way they know to propagate is to make tubers. So when you pull these out of your pots in the fall, you'll have a whole crop of sweet potatoes in there. Usually they're not very good. They're real starchy and not that sweet. But if you were starving, you could eat them. So great foliage color though. And these have come a long way in the last few years. What they're breeding for now is not crop production, but ornamental value. And part of that ornamental value means that they're dwarfer selections that maybe when they're full grown are only 2 feet wide instead of 8 feet wide. And that is a big help. So look for some of those newer varieties that are more compact. One of the things that I really love are some of these new heat-tolerant verbenas that they've come out with in the last few years. Because these shades of light, sort of lavender, lilac blue, whatever you want to call it, this is one of the greatest blending colors that there is in the garden. This will go with purple, it will go with pink, it will go with yellow, it will go with orange, and it will help all of those colors come together in containers. When you pair it with something like this trailing rose coleus, it will actually pull the blue out of the pink in that coleus, and it makes a really pretty combination with plants like that. So most of these that we've talked about so far, sweet potato vine and all that, are sun plants. So let's stick with sun plants here for a few more minutes. Everybody grown this dichondra, Silver Falls? If you've not grown this in containers, you're missing out, and especially in hanging baskets. Now, I'm not a big hanging basket guy because there's no way to get around watering hanging baskets 2 or 3 times a day once July gets here. Even if you use the little water crystals in the soil that absorb extra water, you have to water. When something is hanging up in the air and the wind is blowing around it and the sun is beating on it, it dries out. So I don't do a ton of hanging baskets, but boy, there is nothing prettier than a basket because this little tiny pot will hang 6 feet by the end of the summer. So, and it won't just be one little thread hanging down. It will be this cascade of silver foliage that is just beautiful. This is one of my favorite spiller plants for edges of containers. Right around these is dichondra, Silver Falls dichondra. So you go right around the edges with it, and it will just be this cascade of silver foliage. And they grow fast. Those ground covery things, you know, in a few weeks, they'll be hanging way down the sides of the pots. It's not like you have to wait all summer long for that to happen. Coleus. I don't think any of us who garden can say enough good things about coleus. Used to be coleus when I was a boy was a shade plant only. My grandmother grew it. A lot of times grew it from seed. And most of the sun coleus actually started with a breeding program down in Florida, at the University of Florida. And they were selecting coleus for sun tolerance in the Florida landscapes. And over the last 20 years, now there are probably 200 different varieties of sun-tolerant coleus on the market. And the nice thing about coleus is that most of them will do part shade to full sun. Certain varieties will actually do better in the sun, certain varieties will do a little better in the shade, and most of your garden center folks can answer some of those questions for you, but a lot of the ones that are labeled sun coleus were bred in Florida for sun tolerance, so they will certainly take full sun here in Tennessee. The little white diamond euphorbia, another plant that, you know, I don't do much white in my garden, but I like this. And the reason I like this is because those little flowers fall off to nothing and they don't trash up everything. Most white flowers turn into a big brown blob when they die. And these just fall on the ground like little snowflakes and then they just disappear. So this is a great filler plant for in and around dark foliage things, in and around lighter foliage things. It'll go with almost anything. This is a great little thing to just shove into the center of a pot somewhere and just let it grow where it can.
Is that diamond frost?
Diamond frost euphorbia. Diamond frost euphorbia. Sun plants. It'll tolerate some shade, but it is a euphorbia. It is related to that succulent group of euphorbia. So the more sun you give it, the better it'll do. Talk about one more really good sun plant here real quick. And a couple of tropicals. I know everybody who's probably grown Angelonia. The first time I ever saw Angelonia, ever, was about 15 years ago in Orlando, Florida, at the end of June, in a great big pot in the parking lot at Disney World, in the middle of an asphalt parking lot in Orlando, Florida, in a pot. It was 118 degrees on the surface of that parking lot, and these things were standing up like they didn't care, they were big and pretty, and I came back home, I asked one of the horticulture staff what it was, because we'd never seen it before. And he said it's Angelonia, and I came back, I was doing some consulting with More and More Garden Center in Nashville at the time, and my friend Robin Brown, who has a magnificent garden and manages that garden center, I came home and I said, I'm going to tell you what the next big annual is for next year. So whoever you need to call and tell them to find the plugs and start growing it, they need to start growing Angelonia, because it's going to be hot, hot, hot. And I think it hit the market really big the next summer, and it never stopped. And now there are all these spreading forms, and there are forms that get taller and look like big weeds, and it's this Angel Face series, the old original Angel Face series that is still the very best one out there. The spreading ones are fine, I guess, if you want something that lays flat on the ground. And some of the taller series that are supposed to look like heat-tolerant snapdragons, they don't. They look like roadside weeds. It's just my opinion, but as a friend of mine in the music business used to say, that's my opinion, it ought to be yours. No, but in all seriousness, Angelonia, you'll just never ever go wrong with Angelonia. And the nice thing about it is Angelonia, most of these hybrids are sterile, so they don't have to be deadheaded. And if they sort of bloom themselves out toward the end of the summer, you cut the whole plant back and feed it really heavily and water it really well for a few weeks, and it will completely reflush from the base and bloom until frost. All right, these are not coleus. These are chenille plants. And there is a whole group of these out there now. This is one with these multicolored variegated leaves, and the more sun you give this, the more coppery this will become. These will be green and red and pink. Growing in a little shade right now in the greenhouses. This is another variety of the same plant with these big, and these leaves will get 8 or 10 inches long and 8 inches wide by the end of the summer, and they'll just undulate and curl and have these funky little edges on them. Great tropical plants to use as fillers or even as focal points, because what is in those gallon pots now by the end of the summer will be this tall. They also make great plants for the garden. We talked about the Dianella. This is a plant that not a whole lot of people know, and it has a name that's a great big mouthful. This is Pseudoranthemum. But this is a variety called Black Varnish, and those leaves are almost black. And if you get this out in just a little bit more sun, they'll really turn black and shiny. And sometimes I think we're too focused on color combinations and not focused enough on the play of light and dark. Forget about whether purple and orange go together or whether fuchsia and blue look good together, and work on those, the play of sort of light and dark and broad foliage versus grassy foliage, you know, these kinds of things, light and shadow. It's more about painting, and while color obviously is important when you're painting, it really becomes more about the play of light and dark and shadow and light, those kinds of things. So don't forget about that when you're gardening. And this is a great little foliage plant also. This will grow in the full sun, but I actually like it better in maybe morning sun or even high dappled shade all summer long. And it will become almost iridescent. It almost has kind of an aluminum sort of quality to it. It gets kind of silvery. It stays this purpley color, but it also gets kind of silvery. Anyway, there's just a whole world of interesting things out there. And before I kind of wrap up and take some questions, I thought we should talk for just a minute about growing edibles in containers, because there are always questions about can I grow my herbs in pots? Well, obviously, yes, herbs are easy to grow in pots. Can I grow my vegetables in pots? Absolutely. So let's talk about that for a minute. Herbs are pretty easy in pots. Herbs, most of our favorite summertime herbs anyway are basil and oregano and rosemary and those kinds of things. They're Mediterranean plants. They like it hot. So they thrive here in the summertime. It's not a problem for them. You can grow them in containers. Here's some good sweet basil. I was going through the greenhouse this morning. John had some plants in there that had ripe tomatoes on them. So I had basil and tomatoes this morning before anybody else. When I got here about 10:30, I stole one. This just smells like summertime. There's no better smell than this. It makes me want pesto. So yes, your basil will do beautifully in containers, and you can have it right up close to the kitchen where you don't have to traipse all the way out to the garden to get it. Don't forget about these beautiful purple types of basil. Now these have a little more licorice flavor to them rather than being so sweet, generally speaking. But these are just as ornamental and just as edible as the green forms of basil, and equally as beautiful. Peppers, easy in containers. Peppers don't have a huge root system, so they're great to grow in pots. You can even grow peppers in pots as small as 12 or 14 inches. They do still need some root run. But you can, in a 14-inch pot, you could probably plant 3 pepper plants and have enough peppers to supply you most of the summer. And here's the beautiful thing about peppers. They like hot soil. They don't even want to be in the ground until the soil temperature is about 75 degrees, which for us in the garden ground, in the ground, that doesn't happen until the middle of May or the third week of, your soil is not up into those 70s until 15th of May. In containers, you can stick those things out in the sun and heat that soil up and get peppers going a month before you can get them going in the ground. And the same way with eggplant. You can do eggplant in containers very, very easily. And they like hot feet. They are from the equatorial belt is where eggplant and peppers are native to. So the hotter and more humid it is, the better they like it. And again, you can, if you stuck this out in the ground now while the soil temperature is 62, 63 degrees, it's going to sit there and probably the roots are going to rot off of it. And, we always used to say in the garden center, absolutely, I'll be happy to sell your tomato plants to you on March the 15th, and I'll sell them to you again on April the 10th, and I'll sell them to you again on May 1st. Be more than happy to do that for you. I tend to just sort of like to plant my tomatoes once. And speaking of, can you grow tomatoes in containers? The answer is yes, you can. Not just the patio types, and I'm not a real big lover of patio tomatoes. First of all, they're bred to be short, not bred to be flavorful. So most of the patio tomatoes, in my opinion, aren't really that good. Now, what are good in containers are your Roma tomatoes, the little pear-shaped sauce tomatoes, because those are determinate plants, which means they reach a certain size and they stop growing. For patio tomatoes, not only do they stop growing, they stop fruiting. So once you have harvested one crop of tomatoes, they'll set one time, and once they've set and those fruits are ripened, that's it. You're not getting any more. They're done. Romas are a little bit better because they set many, many clusters of tomatoes over a period of time on a compact plant. So Romas are really great for containers. What about cherry tomatoes and the old Better Boys and Big Boys and beefsteaks and those kinds of things? Absolutely, you can grow them in containers. Remember that they are indeterminate. A lot of people, my grandfather used to call the tomato plants tomato vines. And there's a reason. They have that viney characteristic. They don't have a tendril like a true vine that hooks onto something and keeps it held up there. But they do have that long, sprawling tendency. So you have to do one of two things. You either have to be willing to prune them to keep them sort of in bounds, or you have to be willing to plant them in a pot this big. Put them in a half whiskey barrel, or put them in a great big pot like this that will give them the root run that they need in order to be healthy and happy, and let them stick a big old tomato cage in here and let it grow. You know, my tomato cages would fit in that. And I also always say that if the only tomato cage that you need is one of those little squatty wire ones that's about 30 inches tall, you're not growing your tomatoes the right way. Because I grow mine in 5-foot tall concrete reinforcing wire cages, and they grow out the top and all the way back down to the ground, usually by the end of the summer. So for those indeterminate tomatoes, the standard type tomatoes, you need a big container, and you must feed and you must water. If you do not water, if you let your tomato plants dry out and stress out, there are several things that will happen. First, your tomatoes will all crack. Your fruit will all crack because when the plant needs water, they absorb the water out of the fruit. And then when you water the plant, they're trying to propagate, and the seed is inside that fruit. So the very first thing that happens is the roots suck up that water and they shoot it straight into the tomatoes first, and they go and they crack along the side. That's why if you've had a drought and then you get a big rain, you'll notice that all of your tomatoes in your garden are cracked along the side. So even in the ground, you have to keep your tomatoes watered all the time. If you don't, if they go through a dry, wet, dry, wet, dry, wet, that's when they crack. So really important that in a container you keep those tomatoes damp all the time and watered well. Tomatoes, regardless of whether they're patio tomatoes, determinate type bushy tomatoes, or indeterminate vining type tomatoes, are heavy feeders. The more you feed them, the more they will flower. The more they flower, the more fruits you will have. And the only fertilizer, the only nutrients they have are what's in that container, and they are provided by you. So if you don't want your tomatoes to stop setting halfway through the summer, you have to keep feeding, 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 feeding. So yes, absolutely, you can grow all kinds of edibles in containers. If it's not tomatoes that you don't want, I'll tell you what, those little 3 and 4 foot tomato cages, the little wire ones that are kind of cone shaped, are really good for. Turn them upside down, tie their wire prongs together, and set them upside down in a pot and make a teepee out of them, and grow whole beans on them. Or grow Malabar spinach. If you've never grown Malabar spinach, you know spinach, real spinach is a spring crop. It likes it cool, and by June it's done. Malabar spinach is related, but it is a red-stemmed, green-leafed vine that grows in the heat of the summer, and you eat it just like you eat spinach. It tastes just like spinach, but it's a heat-loving, vine type of, it's a spinach cousin. It's a very interesting plant. And you can find seed for it in various places. And sometimes I see it in garden centers, but Malabar spinach, Malabar, M-A-L-A-B-A-R. It's an interesting plant. But grow some sort of vine thing on there, pole beans or whatever. And let that be sort of the centerpiece of your pot. Then have your basil or your eggplants or your peppers or whatever else around the base. So that's a way to get double duty out of the container. All right, well, that kind of goes through a whole big, wide selection of things, and I don't know that it was all that exciting or interesting, but hopefully it was. And I would be glad to stand up here for a few minutes and answer some questions. It's about 10 minutes after 2, and then when we're done with that, I brought the new book, and it's over there at the table. And I'll sign a few books if anybody's interested in purchasing them. And what else should I tell you? Oh, well, let's answer some questions, and we'll do a little wrap-up session at the end.
Do you replace the soil? Do you bring in your pots and bring them out?
Do I replace my soil? No, I don't, because it gets too costly. So I replace about 1/3 of my soil in my containers every year. So every 3rd year, in theory, it's being completely changed out. And what I do with the old soil is spread it in the compost. And what I generally do is I take like 1/3, What you don't want to do is replace the top third every year, because then you're never replacing the bottom 2/3. So I get my wheelbarrow out and I take the top third, top half out, and then I take a bunch out that I'm going to throw away, put it in a different bucket, or not throw away, but put it in the compost. And then I sort of stir up what's in the bottom, add some back from the compost, add some back from the wheelbarrow, add some fresh, and I just kind of keep stirring it all together and try to blend it up as much as I can. If you just replace the top third every year, after a few years, the bottom 2/3 is all of a sudden 5 or 6 years old, and compact it down in there in the bottom, and you're not getting any good out of it. So.
What about squash? You're talking about vegetables.
What about squash? Can you grow squash in containers? Yeah, you can. You probably would do better with zucchini and the bush type squashes, the little patty pan squashes, and those things that don't grow on a 15-foot vine. But yeah, you can grow squash in containers. You can grow almost anything in a container that doesn't just require an enormous amount of room to spread. You probably could grow, if you flipped one of those wire cages upside down and put it in there, you could grow cucumbers, grow bush cucumbers on, so that, again, you're not growing a 10-foot vine, but you don't want to take up ground space with bush cucumbers. Grow up a little 5-foot teepee in the middle of a pot. The other thing that will happen if you grow your cucumbers on a trellis or on a teepee of some kind, they don't get all funky on one side where they're laying on the ground, and they'll grow nice and straight and be really pretty cucumbers. So, yes?
Is the dianella a sun plant?
The dianella is kind of this. Dianella is kind of a part sun to shade plant. I have grown it in the full sun, but it is happier where it has morning sun or high dappled shade. Oh, and I know one little plant I forgot to talk about. I specifically brought this out. For those of you who are gardening in the shade and who want good long color all summer long, this is actually a relative of the African violet. This is called Streptocarpella, which is a great big name. But John's got a greenhouse full of these, and they look really good. And the mother plant is 2 feet across out there in the greenhouse that he takes all of his cuttings from. It's a great hanging basket plant, and it's a great little edge of the pot. It'll get probably 8 or 10 inches tall and maybe 15 inches, 18 inches wide over the course of the summer. And if you planted it in edge, look how pretty it is in that orange. It'll hang down over the edge of the container. It will, this is nothing, these little few flowers that it has on it. It will completely cover itself all summer long with these little purple blooms.
And the name of it?
Streptocarpella. Streptocarpus, but this is a little miniature form. Streptocarpella. This is a proven winner. This is out under several names on the market, several different varieties, and they're all good. But you really, if you don't know this little plant, they've got them here, and you really ought to try it once. You will notice on some of them that they have little light green marks on the leaves that almost look like they've been sunburned, but they're not. They're like African violets. They hate cold water. So early in the spring, when they're growing them in the greenhouses and the water that's coming out of the hose is still cold from the ground, sometimes you'll notice, but that'll go away. As they grow through the summer and the water warms up and you're watering them, they won't mark up like that anymore. So if you see them out in the greenhouse somewhere and they look like they have little sunburn spots on their leaves, it's not. It's just from the water still being cold when it comes out of the hose for them to get watered. So it'll pass. But that's a great little shade plant. One of my favorites. I like it. I had it last summer in some terracotta pots on the front porch with that bright orange bonfire begonia and kind of a limey green chartreuse coleus like that one down there. So, all right. Questions? Other questions? You can ask them. Yeah. A problem with ants. Yes, ants and scale. And the truth of the matter is, probably you have the scale first, would be my guess, because the ants are coming to the scale because they want to nurse the scale for that sweet honeydew that the scale releases. So more than likely, you get the scale first, and the honeydew attracts the ants. And the scale can come in from almost anywhere. It can be almost invisible and come in when you buy something at the greenhouse, unfortunately, and that happens sometimes at the garden center. It can fly in from who knows where. It can overwinter. If you overwintered a house plant, it may go almost completely unnoticed all winter long, and then you get it back out and it crawls over to something else, and then all of a sudden you've got scale. But almost always the ants are coming to the scale, and the ants are not bringing the scale to the plants. But they're after that sweet honeydew that the scale secretes, much the same way as aphids and mealybugs and those kinds of things. And the ants will then farm them and make them grow and get bigger and worse because they're farming the scale for that honeydew they wanted. So what do you do about it? Ants are insects, so most insecticides, organic or otherwise, will take care of them. The difficulty with ants is most of the time they're burrowing down in the ground, so unless you get something that comes in contact with them, it's hard to get rid of them. But one of the things that I would recommend, if you get a bad infestation of ants in a container, there's a product called diatomaceous earth, which is organic, and it actually is little diatoms that they filter out of seawater. And they're like, it's dusty, and you really ought to wear a mask when you use it, not because it's poisonous, because it's so fine it will go airborne, and it's very irritating to your lungs if you breathe it in. It won't hurt you and won't kill you, it's just irritating. But if you spread a good layer of it around the surface of the soil and water it in, what happens with soft-bodied insects like ants, those little tiny microscopic diatoms are like little shards of glass, and that's why if you breathe it, it's irritating to your lungs. And they will actually embed themselves in the bodies of ants and grasshoppers and aphids and scale and mealybugs and those kinds of things, and kill them. So it's a totally organic way to handle them. I would try that first before you go to, if it really got bad and you really needed to do a number on them. Probably as far as chemicals go, the safest thing that's out there that can be either two insecticidal soaps, or if you really need to go to the chemical route, liquid 7. It's been on the market for 60 years and has undergone tens of thousands of toxicity tests. I do not spray it willy-nilly around the garden because it is not selective. It will kill good insects as well as bad. But if you have a really bad infestation of ants in containers, mix it up in a bucket according to the instructions on the label and drench the soil with it. It is non-systemic, so the roots of the plants can't pick it up. You can even use it that way on, I've used it occasionally. There actually is a mealybug that will get in the roots of your tomato plants sometimes. And if I've had root mealybugs in tomatoes, I have used a 7 drench right on the root system of the tomato. It's totally non-systemic. The plant can't pick it up. So you don't have to worry about your fruit being contaminated. Scale is hard to kill because that scale coating, that wax coating, is actually protecting the insect underneath it. It's like a little saddle that just sheds everything off of it. If you can get it in the crawler stage, when it is a soft-bodied insect, before it forms that brown, scaly, hard shell over the top of it, you can kill it with 7, you can kill it with 7 dust, diatomaceous earth, any number of other things. But once it forms that crusty, hard scale over the top of it, about the only thing that will kill it is something systemic that it then sucks out of the plant. And that means that you cannot use a systemic insecticide on anything that you're going to eat. You can only use it on ornamentals. And we try to stay away from those things. And unfortunately, there's not a really good systemic organic out there. The systemics are all, sort of toxicity chemicals. for the nectar, it is potentially contaminated, yes. Depends on how long the chemical lasts in the plant. It'll tell you on the label. Usually if it says apply every 6 weeks, that means it has about a 6 week life in the plant. And it's, I don't spray very many systemics. The one thing that I do spray are my daylilies because they get thrips so bad. And the thrips get inside the daylily buds and they make the flowers deformed and streaked and all kinds of things. But what I do is I spray the systemic really early in the season, like now. And then by the time they bloom in June, that chemical is all gone out of the plant. It's already killed all of the thrips, and the thrips are gone. But when the butterflies and the bees and the hummingbirds and whatever come to the daylily flowers, I'm not killing the good creatures that I want. I've already done away with the thrips, but the chemical has long since dissipated in the plant, and it's not carried in the nectar and the flowers. Yes?
You mentioned compost a while ago. What is your recommendation for composting at home?
What is my recommendation for practical compost at home? Compost is a difficult thing to deal with because the garden produces so much waste, but it produces it sort of all at one time. You know, you get that big fall cleanup and you've got all of this detritus that you need to do something with, and unfortunately by the end of the season, most of that stuff is going brown, and you don't have enough green to brown ratio to make the compost really do what it's supposed to do. My compost pile, I tend to use grass clippings, kitchen waste, and the normal amount of green material that comes out of my garden from pruning and weeding and trimming and whatever during the course of the growing season. And then in the fall, when I have big loads of stuff, I use only the leafiest, softest material that will break down the fastest for a couple of reasons. First of all, I don't want to create compost piles that have to sit there for 3 years before they break down. And if you get a lot of either woody or sort of dry leafy material in there, it takes a long time for that material to break down. Secondly, I don't want to have a compost pile that's 15 feet across and 8 feet high that, you know, it's just this big pile of junk sitting there for a couple of years until it breaks down. I have 3 different bins made out of what do you call them? Pallets, yes. So my bins are not big, and I don't produce enough of my own compost, quite frankly, to compost my whole garden to spread compost over my whole garden every year. I can probably do a third of the garden every year. So every third year, you know, you sort of start over. But I haven't found the magic answer to that, to be quite honest with you. I mean, I try to do my best, and I want to produce as much of my own compost as I can. I can't realistically produce enough to use throughout my garden every year. But what I do, I have 3 trees. Well, I have more than 3 trees. Unfortunately, I have a river birch in my yard that I would like to do the one-cut pruning job on at the ground. But my 3 biggest trees are white oaks, which make fabulous leaf compost. The thing with leaves is that you have to be willing to wait for that 2 or 3 year period, and I'm fortunate enough that I have a place where I can do that. So I have a place outside of the main part of the garden, outside of the fence, where I have years worth of leaves, and every year I do another strip, and so the leaves that are 4 and 5 years old that have broken down over here on this end, and the fresh ones are down there at that end. And rather than true compost, I use more leaf mold in my garden than anything else, which is just old broken down. I don't run them through a shredder. I don't do anything to them. It's all I can do to get them all picked up usually in the fall. And I have a pile about 15 feet long and 8 feet wide and 4 or 5 feet high by the time I get them all piled up. And by the end of the first winter, they're only about this thick. They just all compress down. And 2 or 3 years later, I have about 10 inches of the most beautiful black crumbly leaf mold. And I tend to use that in my garden more than I use my actual compost because I just can't produce enough good compost for the size that my garden is. Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's a great idea. She said she uses her tomato cages, and as she's chopping up leaves in the fall, she just fills the tomato cage, and it kind of composts down in the tomato cage, and you just pull the tomato cage off, and it just falls in the garden right where you need it. That's great. So. All right, a couple more, and then we probably, I don't know what time it's getting to be, but we probably ought to, ooh, it's 2:30, y'all. They're giving me the thumbs up to back. Keep going. I do have to get back on the road by about 4, so it depends on how long we're going to stand here and sign books and do whatever. But let's answer a couple more questions.
What kind of systemic do you use? I've used that Bayer. It's got that nicotine. I guess I can't pronounce the words. The nicotine base. It looks like they're going to be taking that off.
I think those nicotine-based products are going to probably come off the market. What's a good systemic? If I have to use a systemic, I use Orthonex. Orthonex is a combination insecticide, fungicide, and I use it on my daylilies in the spring to get rid of thrips and daylily rust. And most of the time, even though it's not labeled for daylily rust, knock on wood, I've been doing this 5 years now, heavy in daylilies for almost 5 years now, doing some breeding and stuff, and I've not had any daylily rust, and I only treat once a year with the Orthonex. Now I'm also real careful about bringing in daylilies from Florida and other places that have horrible rust problems. But I can kill the insects and the fungus in one fell swoop with Orthonex.
So now would be the time.
Now. Mm-hmm. Now's the time to do it. Yeah. So, yes.
I have an established perennial shade garden.
Yeah.
I have a lot of boxwood, I have coral bells, I have hostas and cotton.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what do I need to in my soil? What can I go in there and do?
In my shade garden, I use as much compost as I can produce, but in my shade garden, primarily I use the leaf compost, the composted leaves and the leaf mold. And the earthworms will come up and they'll incorporate it down. I put generally in the late winter, I go in and weed everything out nice and clean, and I put down about 1.5 inches of the oldest, most completely decomposed leaves. And within a few days, you'll see the places where the earthworms have started coming up to get that leaf compost, and they'll grab it and take it back down in and sort of incorporate it for you. So, yeah, that's what I use. All right. I have the new book, the Southern Gardener's Handbook. I have lots of. If anybody's interested in the first book, which was Plant This Instead, that I had here last fall, it is on back order from the warehouse right now, and it'll be about 2 weeks before I have it. But you are welcome to buy it today, and I will sign it and send it over here to you at my own expense. If you want to buy copies of it, you're welcome to. I'll get your name and address, and I'll sign them and send them over. But I have plenty of Southern Gardener's Handbook with me. I mentioned traveling. If any of you are interested, if you like to travel, if you love to see beautiful gardens, about 3 years ago, with some friends from Indianapolis, I entered into a little venture with them, one that they'd already had going, and we now lead garden tours all over the world. We have a trip coming up in August, late August, early September, to Belgium and Normandy for 10 days, which is actually right on the heels of the England trip that Jason Reeves and Andy Pulte are doing for UT. It's a rough life. I'm leaving the 7th of August and not coming home until the 7th of September, and I'll be in England and then in Belgium and France for a month. And then in November, the 19th of November, we're leaving for 3 weeks in New Zealand and Australia. So we'd love to have you. And if you're not interested in those trips but would like to know about future trips, I have a sheet over there where you can sign up, and we'll keep you on our email list for 2016, which we'll be announcing about the 1st of September. in 2017, which we'll probably be announcing in May or June of next year. So we're trying to get it to a point where we're working about 12 to 18 months out on most of our travel. So we go all kinds of places all over the world and see some really beautiful things. So we hope that some of you will join us at some point.
What about the States?
What about the States? I actually have a trip, I hope, coming up in October. It's going to be a short trip, I think, probably Sunday to Saturday, and we're going to go to Philadelphia, do the Brandywine Valley, see Longwood Gardens, Chanticleer, a bunch of the DuPont estates, and that trip will be a fundraiser for our television show, Volunteer Gardening. We did a trip to England last summer. We're going to try to do, if this is successful and we do these fundraising trips and it works for the show, we're going to try to do an international trip every other year, and then in the in-between year, do a stateside trip, which generally will be shorter and a whole lot less expensive. So we're trying to sort of reach out to everybody and do some of those kinds of fun things. All right. Well, I think we're going to have a little music. And
don't be rushed. You go ahead.
no. I'll be getting hoarse here in a minute if I can stand up here and keep talking. But thank you all for coming out. I know it's a great day to be out gardening and doing other things, so I appreciate that you took time out of your